Welcome to Dr. M's Vodcast, a vodcast with a mission to connect continuous improvement professionals across the world.
Namaste from Dr. M from India, and welcome to Dr. M's podcast. And thank you very much for being there for us. And in our minds and in our heart is Dr. Deming. And thank you very much, Dr. Jakie, that you have spent time with him, 5 years that you were with him. We would like to remember him through your eyes, through all your memories. So this episode on Dr. M's podcast, we're going to listen to you. So thank you very much, all of y'all. And over to you, Jakie. Let's hear from you.
Okay, so the nice thing about this is it's made me dig up all my old stuff and reminisce over the last few days about the time I did spend with Dr. Deming. But I'm happy for people to ask me questions. I guess the most stunning thing about working with Dr. Deming was how hard he worked, right? So I would, as various people did, was you'd go in and you'd work with him maybe for a few days or for a few weeks at a time. And I did a long stint where I worked with him for a month. And then I flew back to Australia with a work colleague from America. And he said, I fell asleep before the plane took off. And I did not wake up until after the plane had landed. He had to wake me up. So it just shows you how tired I was, right? Because Dr. Deming was so driven and he worked so hard, and he worked harder than I was in my late 20s at the time. It was hard for me to even keep up. So that just shows you how hard he worked. So just to go back, how to maybe where I met him, that I was working in General Motors. I was doing a doctorate, and I was working with the supplier base of General Motors in Europe, and we were implementing Japanese methods, which of course came from Dr. Deming and Dr. Juran, right? And in fact, I'd actually studied a lot more about Juran because he wrote a lot of the tool stuff than I had with Deming. When I went to write my doctorate up before I moved to Australia, I started consulting with a company who were a Deming-based consulting company. And they sent me to a Deming seminar. And that's where I met Dr. Deming. I was fortunate to have a letter of introduction from my boss, Mike Cleary, for which I will always be grateful. And yeah, and when I went to get my book signed, on the first day, I got to meet Henry Nave, and I got to meet Dr. Deming, and I had my book signed, and he read the letter, and he said, oh, you'll be my recorder of red beads tomorrow. And we all know the red bead experiment. And those of you who don't, please look it up. So I became his recorder of the red bead the following day. And so, of course, the slide that he would put on the overhead projector, because it was old days, right? In the overhead projector, you just filled in the numbers straight onto the overhead projector. But he had all his maths calculations there. So, and I was familiar with the maths. So I thought, oh, should I keep going? And Henry's like, do it. So I did all the calculations, completed it all, had all the control limit calculations and stuff finished. And then Dr. Deming afterwards said to me, nobody's ever done that before. And I'm like, oh, was I not supposed to? And he said, no. It was great that you did. Tell me more about what you're doing. And then we got chatting. And then he asked me if I would be one of his students. And of course, you're not going to say no to that. And I was lucky that I worked with a company who said, spend as much time as you want with him. And I was fortunate that as Deming and I got to know each other and became friends, I was well known for challenging him. So if there was something I didn't kind of didn't sit with me. We would debate and have lively discussions, and never arguments, but lively discussions, definitely, as we sparred the ideas. And of course, that's what helped me learn, right? Is discussing and debating and discussing what you don't understand. So, yeah, as I was saying before, he worked really hard. I found this, which is a schedule of his public seminars only from 1992. So just to give you an idea, so these were the ones he was doing with Nancy Mann's group, Quality Enhancement Seminar. So this is just one of the groups. And in January, he was in San Jose. In February, he did Miami and Philadelphia. In March, he did Newport Beach and Orlando. May, he did Dallas. June, he did Seattle. July, he did Newport Beach. August, he did Indianapolis. In September, he did Atlanta. In October, he did St. Louis and Charlotte. And November, he did Washington. And December, he did Phoenix. And that was just one set, right? He was going overseas. That year, in the early part of the year, he did a 4-day seminar in Australia. There was also, which is not talked a lot about, was the 2-day seminars that he used to do as well, which was about instituting Dr. Deming's methods of management of productivity and quality. And they're not talked about as much as the normal 4 days are, but that was about people talking about their real life experiences of implementing his work. So on top of all this, he did seminars for joiners. He did other seminars with Myron Tribers, Joyce Orsini. He did the private General Motors ones. He did the private Ford ones. And these are as well as going to London and working with the British Deming Association. So these are ones that I just happen to know about because I've been involved at some point in time. But he worked 7 days a week. So if you joined him, you worked 7 days a week. And these were big days, right? He was up early. Early breakfast. He would work before he went to a seminar or what. If you were doing a 4-day seminar, he would work. Quite often there was piles and piles of books that people wanted him to sign. So you could spend an hour and a half, 2 hours with him just signing books for people that you'd carried, to his rooms to get him to sign. He would then do the seminar. He would take little breaks and he would get cat naps. He lived on cat naps. He would have 15, 20 minutes cat naps here and there that kept him going. But you could be going from, when you're assisting him, you could be going from like 6, 7 o'clock in the morning all the way through till 10, 11 o'clock at night. And of course, good night, Dr. Deming, wasn't it for your brain? Your brain would keep wanting to go and think about what you've been doing during the day, right? So your brain would still be going at 100 miles an hour when you were supposed to be sleeping. So, and he would keep, a typical week would be Monday, fly to New York, teach at Columbia, then fly on to where he was maybe doing a 4-day seminar, which he did a lot of, obviously. You do your 4-day seminars, fly back to Washington on a Friday. Saturday was kind of the breathe out day, work on correspondence, work on his book, work on plans for the next few weeks. Sunday, church, fly to New York, do the rest of it, do it again. So, and that's what he did week in, week out. I mean, I would think all of us would struggle to do that, right? And I know he had a great support network around him, but his energy for his work and his willingness and wanting to make a difference was just incredible. If you were fortunate to be with him in Washington on a Saturday night, he might take you to the Cosmos Club. And I don't know whether you've ever heard of this, but this is a quite elite club in Washington where you would go and dine with him, and he liked you to eat what his favorite was, which was lamb chops with the brightest green mint jelly you have ever seen, with vegetables. And then the ice cream that he loved. He was a big lover of ice cream. and he loved the hazelnut ice cream that they made. They had a special name for it, and I cannot remember what the name was, but it was like a hazelnut ice cream. It was amazing. So if you were lucky enough, you'd get to go to the Cosmos Club with him and experience that. And he was a very prestigious member of that club. And there's a lot of prestigious members of that club. You know, when you're in the dining room, you would be recognizing people around the room because they were politicians or whatever. But, you know, so he was incredibly kind. When you work with him, his kindness was incredible. You know, like taking you out for a meal on a Saturday night was important to him. The first time I went to New York was with Dr. Deming, and he insisted that we landed at LaGuardia Field. And that's because when you fly into LaGuardia Field Airport, you fly literally into the center of New York or to the edge of New York. So you fly down the river and you get that amazing view of New York. He knew I was very, very interested in trains. So when we had an opportunity, because I've worked in rail a lot, and whenever we had an opportunity, we'd get on a train and talk about trains and train systems and how all of that worked. And he showed me parts of America that I would never have seen otherwise, including a not so good part of Detroit where, yeah, that wasn't good. So we'd been picked up by Ed Baker from the airport, and he said, "Oh, show Jackie the bad side of Detroit." And we went through these streets, and we went over a rumble strip where they'd blown the tires out, and it wasn't good. You know, the idea was that we were going to get robbed, and Deming turned his hearing aids off, and Ed Baker just drove and got us out of there. So, but we didn't do a lot for the car. Obviously, we did a lot of damage to the car. But yeah, that was one of the more exciting events when I was working with him. What he carried in his jacket was incredible. So when he used to get injections of vitamin B12 from the doctor to help him with his energy levels, right? We all should just sat in a row and all got them. So I held his jacket one day, and it was like, this thing weighed so much. It was really heavy, right? I'm like, what have you got in here? And from the top pocket, in his top pocket, he had notes that were written by Dr. Schuhart. That was in Dr. Schuhart's hand. He carried a fork with him, which I thought was really funny because people assume that he liked Japanese food. And quite often he'd end up in a restaurant where he was expected to use chopsticks and couldn't. So he carried a fork just to always be prepared. So yeah, he was never short of. But please ask me if there's something you'd like to know. Or what would you like to ask me about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you joined him, or you came to know about him at the most. It was an inflection point in his life, I believe. I think he was. I shouldn't use the word struggling and groping, but I think that's exactly what was happening at that time, because he was going through that phase of that he'd spoken so much in Japan, and people asked him to teach in America when he taught in Japan. He was basically repeating himself, but he was puzzled to see why people were not grasping the deeper meaning of what he was trying to say. So I think you met him at that time when he was trying to put things together. So 1988, I believe, was when the change was happening. So do you remember any of those?
Right. So
moments?
When I was digging through all my bits of paper, I did find my very first notes on profound knowledge, which dates back to June 1989.
89.
Have you seen these? Yeah. So Henry, I'm sure, would have given you this, but
yes.
It's only 3 pages long.
Right.
It is actually, and you can see the start of what his thinking was. And I was around when he was trying to nut this out, because he was trying to work out, well, how do I think? How did I come up with these ideas? How, where did the 14 points generate from? And that was what he was trying to do. But it's actually interesting to look back at these notes, because you can see him trying to work that out. And then if you read everything in order, you can see how he pulled his ideas together so that it could be more understandable.
Yeah. No, that because of correspondence that I happened to go through, Henry's correspondence with him, I started seeing the different language come in around December 88, where
Right.
he said people should enjoy their work. And so that's where the change happened. And I think if you've seen, Henry started talking about the new climate, right? So, and he brings in the joy in work. So I started seeing that correspond. Then I went through, like you said here, 89. Jan is one of the letters he wrote to Henry saying that, give me a critique, give me a feedback. And that's where the knowledge of interactions in a system, that happened. It started taking shape. But then came the Myron Tribus moment, right? Where he asked Myron, that you've learned, that you heard me speak so much. What do you think? Well, how would you put in a nutshell what I've been talking about in these last years? And that's when Myron said, systems, people, and variation. And Deming had a theory of knowledge. He said, damn, how did I miss this? And then that's what came to be known later on.
Yeah. When you look at this, you can say that, in some of the areas that he ended up talking about a lot more are quite scant in here. So yeah, you can see, the evolution was quite amazing. And I think the other thing was, so I was privileged to do some consulting work with Dr. Deming, and that was always very interesting, because so I've got some notes from a session we did in November 91, where we went to a large automotive company, which I'm not going to obviously name which one it was, but we went to a large automotive company. And it was very interesting because we met with various groups of people. Now, he set this up so that we would meet with, so we started with the hourly workers, and then we went on to meet with the salaried workers, and then we went on to meet with the management staff, and then we met with the board. And it was actually quite interesting to see. So I've got notes that I took for him. I haven't got my original notes because I took photocopies of my notes when we got back to Washington. And it was interesting to see how the themes he pulled out and the themes that he could clearly see when we were talking with people. And the focus really in that particular time at that particular company was that it was around not understanding how you fit in, not understanding how you contribute. So this is a huge company, right? This is a very, very large organization, and this is just one side of this organization. But it was very interesting when he talked to hourly workers, how people were just opened up and just were really excited to have somebody who was actually willing to listen to them and willing to hear what they had to say. But it was very fascinating in watching him, tear back the inhibitors that there might have been. So, he threw out, there was only me and myself and the hourly workers, and a gentleman that will name nameless, but you can probably guess at least one out of two. But that was the only people that were in the room from a management salaried kind of perspective. And they were still being paid by the number of pieces they produced at that time. And I'm not sure where that's at now. But it was really fascinating to see that how they did not understand how they contributed into the system, even though you're making physical parts, which you would expect it to be easier than when you're doing a more administrative task. And then that theme just kept going, right? And it was a major inhibitor to the joy that they had. And then talking to the people who were salaried, it was actually interesting talking to people who were working on the shop floor who were on piece payment versus those that were salaried, and how different those aspects were, and how the people who were being paid in a piece rate wanted to be salaried and the salaried people wanted to be paid in piece rate, because they could see the advantages of the other side, but they couldn't see the disadvantages, right? So if you're paid to by the number of parts you produce and you've got to do a minimum every so many, then you produce your minimum and then you can go and take a break or leave or whatever. Whereas the salaried workers felt, well, I still have to be here. I still have to continue. It was actually quite fascinating how they saw each other's pros, but not each other's cons. The grass is always greener was a real theme. And then when we went with, we met with some salaried staff that were more in the admin side, and they really didn't understand how they contributed to the system, and that became more and more of a focus. And one woman actually talked about, well, I do this to this particular form, but I don't know whether it's important. I even tried once not doing it to see what effect it would have, and there was no repercussions. So I don't know whether what I do counts at all. And it was actually really quite, and Deming's just able to peel this back, right? And just get these people to open up and talk to him. And because he came over as such I guess like a grandparent, in terms of just wanting to listen to you and wanting to be open to what you said, but in a caring way. It was quite interesting. And then when he got to the management group, again, it was about systems, but about them working as individuals rather than working as a team, and working for individual accomplishment rather than team accomplishment, which led to an interesting board meeting, obviously.
Yeah, because I had interacted with Sheila Ronis. I think you might remember. Sheila, she sent me some notes from Buick Oldsman Cadillac, the BOC group, and that has some kind of echoes of what you're telling me here about how they had a bit of a problem with. Yeah, and she told me something very interesting, that earlier on, the hostility between the United Auto Workers and Ford and General Motors was quite high. But in 1991, United Auto Workers sponsored a Deming 487. That's the extent to which he broke those barriers.
Yeah. He was incredible at doing that. He was absolutely incredible at doing that. Yeah.
On the personal side, there was something that struck me when you said he used to take cat naps. I've heard about this, that he loved cats.
Oh, he loved cats. I've never seen him with a cat, so can't speak to that. I'm trying to. Yeah, I don't remember any cats.
Okay, because there was something, he loved cats, and he spent, I think, one of his PhD students wrote something, and she said that he came over to my house and my cat, just jumped and sat on his lap, and then he tapped her on the head and said, "This is a special quality cat."
I saw him with a koala on his lap in Australia.
Okay.
We took him to the flora and fauna reserve, and he had a koala on his lap at one point, which left him with a calling card, which was not fun. Because he liked to travel very light. That was one of the other challenges about working with Dr. Deming. You weren't allowed check-in luggage. So you weren't allowed hand luggage in the plane, which was always a challenge. So, but his mind never stopped. So something else I found, this is from September 87, and this is notes from a management in a hospital.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, some of you may have seen it, and it's actually really quite interesting how even when he was laying in a hospital bed, it didn't stop him from thinking about the system and what was wrong with the system and how it might need to improve. It was really quite, because it never stopped, right? It never ever stopped for him. It was a constant life, the way he ran his life. So
there's another thing that I thought of. He always felt that when he spoke so much in Japan, that the translators never really captured completely what he had to say, but they did a great job, right? Did he ever mention about that to you? Because the reason I'm asking you this is I'm working with Joyce on the 3rd edition of the Elementary Principles of the Statistical Control of Quality. So I've done my bit of digitizing all of that stuff. But now she's saying that I spent enough time with him to know, I realized why he wanted me to do the 3rd edition, because he would say something and people would interpret it, but he found that I was closest. She was talking on her behalf, that she was closest to him in terms of interpretation. And she says, I think I need to check some of the things that are here. So was there any time that he mentioned about these things to you in passing, that he was not completely understood even by the Japanese?
Not that I remember. We did talk a fair bit about his early days in Japan when he was doing the census and was doing the the early work that he was doing there to determine how many people were still alive, what their needs were, blah blah blah. We talked a fair bit about that kind of period, which is obviously when he very, very first went to Japan, before he was there to teach them, but not that aspect of it. So I'm sorry, I can't help. No, okay. Not that I remember. I should say not that I remember, because it's a while ago now.
Yeah, it was 40 years ago.
So yeah, it is a long time ago.
Jackie, one of the things that really jumps out at me is, as you say, he was putting together this profound knowledge very late in his life. And I guess at some level it gives us all a little bit of hope, doesn't it? Because he was well into his 80s when he was kind of bringing this together. And I think there's a reference in the book even to when I refer to the book, I mean the Deming dimension. There's a reference in that book to say that he says, in the last 3 months of my life, I've learned more. I can't remember the quote exactly, but I've learned more in the last 3 months than I've learned maybe in the last number of years. So his rate of learning must have been phenomenal at that stage. All right, that you were with him.
Yeah. I mean, he was constantly challenging himself and wanting to develop the knowledge more. There was this great feeling that he was going to go on forever, which obviously was not possible. But when you were working with him, he was so strong and so driven. It was hard to consider that it was going to come to a stop at some point, right? And but it was also really apparent that not enough of the world had captured what he was trying to say, which would make the world a better place and would make the world a better place to live in, right? And I guess there was that incredible hunger to keep going, to keep learning, to see what he could capture and translate and bring into the business world. Mm-hmm. So, he was very fascinated by C.I. Lewis's work, particularly, and that was something he continued to keep delving into and searching within himself, how he could translate it so that people could understand it. Because I think that's who Deming was in a lot of ways, was he was able to take, because a lot of the theories, and we know that, is based on the concepts he learned in his 20s from Schuchart, right? But he was able to take them far beyond what Schuhart saw and evolve them into a worldwide industry knowledge, right? And I think he was able to translate that in a way that others haven't. And I think that's what he was trying to do with C.I. Lewis's work as well. He was trying to take that knowledge and expand it and translate it so that people working in systems could understand how knowledge works and how they could use that. That's what I think, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, Deming did a lot. I'm not underestimating what Deming did at all, but for me, he was a great translator. He was able to take really complex theory and put them into practical terms that people could use. And that's really what he was trying to do with profound knowledge and his 14 points, put some substance around it so people could grasp on and understand it.
Yeah. And you've said this before, the theory of knowledge is one of probably the weakest ones in the profound knowledge that we don't really understand or get. And it's something that we need to continue to work on. I guess a lot of that comes from C.I. Lewis.
So if you think about systems, there's a lot of people who've talked, and systems has evolved since, in the last few years, in the last 20 years, a lot has been talked about that. And there's been a lot of people who've worked in that area. And if you talk about variation, there's a lot of work occurred in that area, and there've been people who've taken that forward in a great way. The psychology there's a lot of people who've worked in that area. The theory of knowledge, there are people working in that area, don't get me wrong, but I don't, if you go into a company and you start talking about systems, people, you just talk about systems, they get it. You talk about variation, they get it. Psychology of people, they get that they need that. You talk about theory of knowledge and you get plunk. That it's like, well, what do you mean by that? There's immediately, and I think so I sense this a lot in organizations I work with, is that knowledge will pass through and out of their organizations when people retire, and that knowledge and that learning almost has to be redone. And I'm not saying that this is all that theory of knowledge is about, which it's not, but organizations do not appreciate the knowledge that they have in their organizations, and they don't appreciate that they have to grasp it, and they have to work a way of retaining that. And this is only a tiny part, obviously, of it. But as soon as you start talking about knowledge, people don't really, there's no hooks at the moment that people are grasping onto, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So yeah. I think when you talk to organizations, that's the weakest subject of the four. That's the one that's the weakest for most organizations. And I don't know whether other people's experiences are the same or not.
It's almost like 100 years ago they kind of had this discovery, the Industrial Revolution. Everyone was discovering new things, and it was kind of an era where all of those things were being uncovered and realized and what have you. And whereas we're probably more in an era now where we think we have all the answers, so we're just codifying it to refine it rather than actually understand there's still so much to discover, even in our own organizations.
Yeah, and Deming lived in that extraordinary time when things, and I once said to him, what's been the greatest invention in your lifetime? And he answered the fax machine, which really shocked me. Because you got to remember, cars weren't around. When he was growing up, there was no cars around, and we had lots of conversations about when he was growing up, when he was very young, and about, use the horse and buggies, and he remembers cars starting, and he remembers seeing, the number of cars. He started to count the number of cars when he was growing up, going backwards and forwards to places, just because he could see that the number was increasing all the time, and it was fascinating him how that number was increasing, right? But it was the facts. It's like, I can communicate so much better, and I can communicate around the world so much more easily. I can write a letter. I write a letter to you and I send it, and I'd get to my office first thing in the morning, see the letter, respond to the letter, fax it and fax back to him. Then when he got up, he would read the letter and we would be communicating. So I think, emails, computers were around, but not as commonly used. And he had, because of eyesight and he'd never learnt to type, computers weren't really great for Dr. Deming, right? No, because you've got to be able to type.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to type, and you've got to be able to focus on that particular length, right? So so there was a few barriers there, but yeah, it was really interesting. I think he thought that the communication of being able to talk to people and being able to link to people, and I can just scribble on a piece of paper, talk to so and so about so and so, fax it through to you, and so rather than snail mail. So
that
fascinating.
So brings me to the other. You obviously interacted a lot with Seal Killian.
Oh, Seal, yes, I did. Yes, we've stayed friends for a very, very long time. Long after Dr. Deming.
She used to do the typing for him, right? She typed out all his work.
Oh, she was much more than that. She was his personal assistant.
Oh, she was everything. His Lady Friday, as he called her. She's my Lady Friday.
She was. And she deeply cared about all of us. So, the last time I worked with him, he had visibly shrunk. And when I got to the house, so I met him up in Washington, and my taxi pulled up, and I got out Butterworth Place, and I started to walk down the drive, and the immediate thing was that there was this ramp there that had not been there, obviously, and she shot out the house and said, "Jackie, you've got to know, physically he's much weakened, but watch it, he's got an oxygen on, so the brain is ticking as fast as ever, and he can hear a lot better than he used to." So, she really cared about all of us, right? That, we were all an important part of it. But yeah, she, he worked out of his basement. My husband constantly complains about how messy my office is. And I always say, well, my mentor was Dr. Deming, and his office wasn't tidy either. How he found everything, I don't know. But of course, there was a lot going on through that office, right? She was coordinating all that travel. She was coordinating all his seminars and his diary, dealing with all the correspondence. It's just amazing, typing up his book notes.
Yes. Never stopped.
It just never stopped, right? It never stopped. Yeah. So she worked. So she would mostly see him on the weekend.
Yeah,
because he was out with doing seminars, and so she would be working during the week and at weekends, So she was putting in a lot of hours for all, over 30 years, and she put a lot of hours in. Yes, she was amazing. She was the rock that kept it all together. She was phenomenal.
Yes, it's interesting. You also said that that he was a translator, because when I hear these people say that he plagiarized, I think in all his books he always gave credit to the source.
Absolutely.
In fact,
absolutely.
I think the one teacher I've seen who actually wrote there, heard in a seminar, in the brackets, I heard this in one of my seminars. That means it's not mine. And so when people make those accusations, I just laugh to myself that they don't even know this man. I mean,
it's ridiculous.
He credited ridiculous. Even a small thing which he heard somewhere, that it's not mine.
But he had the ears to hear it, right? He had
exactly.
He was listening. He was listening, and he was trying to put the puzzle together so that other people could see that puzzle, see the picture, and understand the world differently. And I think that's what Deming gives us, is the ability to understand the world differently.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Jackie, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
No, I was going to say, because you've been for so long with him and so close to him, what were the things that actually gave you, the first indication that you are learning something different? Because you're doing a doctorate, so you're already on a path of learning a lot of things, but this was different. And also, what was the thing that allowed you to actually grasp his knowledge, considering that we see today a lot of people trying to go through the material that Dr. Deming left us and still, finding it hard to believe that it can work in our environments or in our days, or they start talking about it's so old and things like that. And even if I go to your mentioning knowledge, I was looking into my library, but I think they're in another bookcase, books on knowledge from 1970s, 1980s, like the same thing, C.I. Lewis. It's old stuff, let's put it that way. But it's how you interpret it and how you actually go to those principles and you make them transcend time, transcend, different areas of work. So what was different from you that you were able to?
So I think when I saw the first 4 days seminar in London, so I was right at the end of my doctorate, and I'd done an awful lot of studying prior to that. But I think what I'd got was pieces of a puzzle where I couldn't see the picture. It's the only way I can describe it, right? That I'd learned a lot of tools, I'd learned a lot of technique, I'd learned a lot of methodology. But what Dr. Deming did for me, and I was very fortunate, because I think if I'd have listened to that seminar years earlier, I wouldn't have got it. And I wonder if I'd have listened to it years later, whether, I think as you get older, your mind gets less flexible to completely changing its ideas. I think it hit me right at the right time, and I was really lucky that that was the case. But it was able to, because at the time I was trying to pull together the ends of my PhD into a cohesive part. And this is the time when I went to see Dr. Deming. And what he was able to do in those 4 days was say, oh, well, that thing over there, well, that fits in this way. And he was able to bring things and put them in context so I could understand an order to them, and I could get a clarity of thinking and understand the aim and the system of my thinking better. Does that make sense? I think I was really lucky. I think just the moment in time that I did it, I was probably at the readiest in my life, right? So it just hit me at the perfect time. So I suddenly started to put things in, and it made a huge leap in my understanding. And I didn't want to go to that 4-day seminar. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I'm trying to write my doctorate up, and you want me to go to spend 4 days over in London? Are you mad? Blah, 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 right? Because I had a time frame that I had to complete in, because I was moving to Australia and I had to get my PhD material in by a certain date. So I was in the last few weeks of that. In the last couple of weeks of that, and I was taking 4 days out, and yet it helped me complete it because I could suddenly see things more clearly. Now, I think I was really lucky in that timing. I think for people like Henry Neve, where you have taught for years and years and years at university in a particular path, and then you discover not that you're on a wrong path, but that there's a path over here that is just so much better. I didn't have to do that transition. But every time I went to a seminar, I got with him, and I did a lot of 4-day seminars with him. Every time I would learn something new and I would build, but it was never, that first seminar, it just felt like clunking pieces into place. And then I felt I was building on that. But it was that, oh my goodness me, now I see this in a different light, this, and you could see how things were fitting together. And I think that's what happens when if people study Deming the right way. I think if people just, pick up the book and then try to read it and study it, I think they find that quite difficult and quite challenging. I think that's where Henry Neve's 12 Days of Deming is really good.
I mean, the reason
it takes you on the journey. Yeah.
The reason I asked this question is for me, again, I didn't have the privilege to know him. I didn't have the privilege at that time to know Henry or anybody who was close to him, but I was running into different types of materials. and people that were saying, oh, we learned this from Dr. Deming. And of course, with my mind at that time, I was asking, okay, which method, which tool? Oh, it doesn't have anything to do
Yeah.
with method and tool. It's how
Yeah.
you think.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's...
Yeah. And I think if you've spent a lot of time with methods and tools, if you get what it did for me was work out where they belong. Right, and what that bigger picture was and how they contributed to the big picture. It's interesting because now, you know, I was reading something the other day where somebody was putting forward this tool, you know, the best thing since sliced bread, blah, 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 blah. And the tool's really well explained, but there's no context, there's no thinking, there's no, you know, how does this fit into the bigger picture? It's all missing.
Yeah.
And
No, that's
and
interesting.
you, sorry.
Yeah,
You-
go ahead,
you-
go ahead.
You mentioned that you were the one challenging him. So from that perspective, how was this going in, especially if it was something that was not necessarily related to something that he was adamant it's right, because we know his
They
staple
weren't
word of
adamant
nonsense.
discussions. They were more like we had a lot of discussions about the European Union, and about the pros and cons around the European Union, and you know how that fitted or didn't fit together. They were more discussions, but you know there were certain things that very early on didn't sit very comfortably with me, and I guess you know, it was trying to understand where he was coming from, that it was slightly different, but I'm talking about shades of red, not white versus black, right?
Yeah. I found that people of his caliber and knowledge have this tendency of not dismissing other ideas,
Yes,
but rather
exactly.
listening and starting to build something, even something new on them,
So
rather than dismissing because they have their own idea.
Yeah, what he hated was, and there was a lot of, was people would just say, yes, Dr. Deming, and write it down without thinking, well, hang on a minute, how does that relate to this? And having that wider discussion. And that's really what I think that's the reason that I enjoyed working with him and he enjoyed me working with him, was that we would have those discussions, that we would have, well, how does that fit with this? You know, we're on this system. How does this relate to it? You know, we had quite extensive discussions about trains, because I was spending such a long time in rail, a lot of time in rail, and you know how the systems fitted together or didn't fit together, and why this system worked better than that, and how that then related to the theories that he had. And you know, there was a lot of, the conversations were very rich. Do we want to do some concluding remarks? I think you had some ideas, Dr. Rim, about what we would do at the end of this.
At the
I
end of
just have one thing
it,
to say. Both of you, I mean, both Andre and Jackie, all started out saying that you were into tools and techniques, and then you sort of suddenly the light bulb went on when you met Dr. Deming. I had this one gentleman here in India who was one of the few people in my country who met Deming in the late 70s, and then again in the 90s. And he had something interesting to say. Now, he was handling the quality department here in Philips, India. And he was having a lot of problem implementing much of the stuff. And he was using Dr. Juran's handbook. And then he wrote a letter to Dr. Juran asking him for help. And you won't believe what Dr. Juran wrote back to him. He said, I think you need to speak to them. Now, I've read that letter. And if people say today, so obviously he was the philosophical master of quality.
So I was working with Deming when we met Dr. Juran at a presentation that Dr. Deming was doing, and there was just incredible respect between the two men. You know, that, and at that point, to be honest, there wasn't that many of them from those experiences and that generation who'd been working in
Yes.
Japan at that time. You know, there was very few in number by that stage, and you know, they were old mates that, you know, old acquaintances that had worked many times together. Yeah, and very respectful. But that's true of Deming, full stop. He was a very respectful person to everybody, whether they knew him or didn't know him. Yeah.
Right, Dr. M, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now you know how confused I am. I wouldn't know what to say except namaste. And thank you very much. Something very good about namaste that we say it for good morning, good evening, good night. And we say see you again. And nice meeting you. And Richard, can you stop recording so that I can talk a little more freely?
Absolutely. There you go.